For this lesson, I'm going to be using a Hanamulla watercolor block. And I'm going to start by just creating that underpainting. The underpainting is going to tell me where all the elements in my scene belong. And I'm just going to wet just in a circle around the edge of the wreath. If you can talk to yourself about why you're painting each different element when you paint it and how much time you want to spend at putting like detail in, for example, that just gives you so much more focus at that early stage. So right now, I know that I want to create the areas of lightest value. I want to leave space for those. And I want to create an underpainting as well of the background. So we're going to mix some color for that. I don't want straight cobalt teal, but cobalt teal with a little bit of this lunar blue I think will work really nicely. And we have a lot of softness taking place in this early first layer. I'm already creating kind of an angular shape for, just a rough edges. I don't want straight lines here. I really like the look of a rustic wreath. So we want it to be a little rough around the edges. I don't want anything that's too polished. And I'll decide as I put this underpainting down if I want to pull more greens out into the background. I'm using a lot of water to move this color around as well. Remember that I just moistened the wreath area, and so the edges of the paper are actually dry right now. So I can work with a lot of water to start to move that color around. One thing I'm debating as I think about the size of my wreath and what it's going to be looking like, what I want it to look like when it's finished, is I'm wondering if I should pop a little bit of that red in early on. Maybe a flower in the corner, one of the sides would look pretty. And thinking petals. It already looks like a holiday wreath, doesn't it? Basic shape. Some of the greens are creeping out a bit here. This is also a stage where you kind of get to know your colors. I'm working with the lunar blue all by itself right now, just dropping in maybe some shadowy blue grays in a couple of spots. I don't want any white spots from dry paper, so I'm making sure the whole page has some paint on it. And this is a really good time to let everything dry so that we can come back and start defining our shapes and working with some negative painting. Just came back to check on my painting. We're about halfway through the drying stage, and I just want to point this out because you hear a lot of people panicking over buckling paper and asking about stretching paper. This is a watercolor block, and it is about half dry, and you can see there's two big ripples. Hoping you can see that. Two big ripples in this paper. They're buckling, and that can feel a little panicky at this stage, but paper does this. When it's wet, it expands, it swells a bit, and then as it dries, the paper fibers tighten up. So it will flatten out as it dries. It's not dry yet. I want to have that sense of my wreath sitting on a dark background, so I want to use negative painting at this stage to start to bring out some of that wreath shape. So we're going to work with the lunar blue and just start to darken up some of those values. And the wonderful thing about beautiful transparent watercolor is that it's really wonderful to see how the values get darker as you layer. You get these beautiful rich layers of color that are just so lovely to look at. And this is negative painting. I'm just defining, darkening the background so that we can see that crisp shape of the wreath, but we're not going to stop there. So I'm just going to define a little bit here. And then I'm going to use a damp brush to soften just where the lunar blue blends with the rest of the background. And then we're going to do a little bit of a lost and found edge. And I don't want to have my wreath looking like it's pasted onto the background. So we're going to take a little bit of our green. And this is the green, the serpentine combined with the jadeite. And we're just going to drop in a little bit of our darker greens here. And I like to then drop in that green shape, let it flow into that lunar blue background in a few spots, and in others we keep that edge crisp. And so then we get what we call a lost and found edge. And a little bit of an indistinct feel where we are not sure quite where the leaves end and the background begins. And this creates some flow between the two elements of the scene. Then we can move to the next part of the wreath, create that background, and then bring in some greenery again. Now, it's very tempting to want to start on this edge and then just move around the wreath clockwise or counterclockwise, whatever feels comfortable for you. But the problem with that is that as you paint, often you develop strategies for working with the different elements in your scene, and the strategy becomes more adept. You start to get a sense for what you like and what you don't like, and you try to do more of that, adding some of that beautiful cobalt teal right into the wreath just for fun. And so I feel like I always have a more consistent look if I don't work in a row, in a line. So I might, now that I've moved downward a bit, I'm going to move upward and go this direction a little bit, so that I'm moving back and forth through the scene with my negative painting. But you can already see there's starting to be a real depth here just by that variation of light and dark in that area. So that's the goal we want to bring out. And that might be the level of detail that I end up with in this painting. I'm not interested in defining every leaf. It's not who I am. I'm liking that addition of a little bit of line there. And since I've been moving along the top of the page, let's now move back down to the bottom. This area is not my favorite. I think we're going to put a lot of shadow in there to define our flower. So let's try maybe looking for some of those darks right now. Look at how that beautiful crisp line right there just looks. Just makes that flower come to life, even though that's all we have for flower right now is just that one line. With my wet brush, I'm pulling some of these colors down and connecting to other elements. And suddenly I have this lovely spiky greenery thing happening there. And here we're going to pull out some more petal shapes, and then that green's going to flow into the background. That's going to be pretty. If I'm thinking about the light hitting my wreath, I might see a bit of cast shadow down underneath the wreath. So let's drop in some indigo to suggest that. This should help give it a bit more of a 3D effect. And I think this is the stage where we might want to tilt a little bit more too. With that shadow, it's moving down the page. It's below the wreath. So gravity is my friend here. If this wreath were hanging on a door, the inner part of the wreath would likely be under shadow, with all of these leaves casting shadows down onto it. So we want to start to create the same negative edge. Look at how that looks like leaves. I'm going to soften a little bit, and then I'm going to use my, I think my serpentine. To create that lost and found edge again, maybe a little bit of the jadeite. And it's negative painting. I'm painting around the wreath to create leaf shapes, but I can also do positive shape painting at the same time. Negative painting is very rarely a solo, I don't know if it's ever a solo thing. You're always, there almost always is the need to actually paint the shapes of your objects as well. I mentioned earlier, we want to be thinking about our goals for each stage of the painting. And at this stage, we are defining the shape of the wreath. And that's really our first priority, is just to catch that sense of shape and start to see the dimension of the wreath come to life. I'm going to look for a petal shape here as well. I'm thinking something like a poinsettia, which means that my petals are going to be a bit spiky on the end. They're pointed on the ends, and then a nice lovely long curve. Something like that should work. I've been painting for about 20 minutes on this, and 20 minutes tends to be my maximum for having a fresh perspective for my painting. Generally, after this long, I've been staring at the painting for a while. It's very easy to lose sight of what my priorities are, or to paint on an area that I should be allowing to dry. Sometimes that happens. Or to work with very fussy, tiny brush marks that tend to make my painting look busy and overworked at this earlier stage of the painting. There actually is a lot of textural brush marks here, a lot of little crisp shapes. My tendency often is to soften those out. And actually, let's take a look. Over here, we have a lot of crisp shapes. Over here, I've allowed those shapes to blend together. Which one do I like better? This is a good question to ask, because it can help me to decide whether or not I want to soften some of these shapes. And I'm going to try to do it with a spray bottle rather than touching my brush to the painting. Layer 3. At this time, I'm going to start to think about the details that are going to bring some dimension to this painting. So I've just added a tiny bit of indigo to my carmine, and we're going to work a little, you can see I've choked up on the brush a little bit because I want to start working with a little bit more control as I think about defining some of the shapes of my flowers and my flower. And I want to use my darker value to make the petals in front come to life, to create some shadows underneath. So I'm just painting a line and then softening it out a bit to create that form and shape. And I love the ability for gentle nuance in watercolor. Our colors can be very soft. Our transitions can be very gentle. We can bring in some boldness as well. We have so much versatility with this beautiful medium. And often when I'm painting this kind of shadow, painting that edge and then using water and a damp brush to soften it out, and it's just a slightly damp brush, it's not saturated with liquid, just a little bit of water to help spread out that color. I'm also defining a petal shape here, creating that curve on both sides. But it just brings me back to my early days of learning to paint in watercolor. I spent so much time painting edges and then softening them to create that really gentle transition. And it was something I loved to do to help create form in my paintings as a new painter. Often I'm painting with less control and a little more boldness in my current transition of style. I'm looking for more freedom in my work, and so I don't do this kind of meditative line and soften the way I used to. So this always brings me back. This petal comes forward, and the one I'm painting with the darker value comes back. So I've spent some time adding detail to this flower and giving it some form and dimension. I'm also taking a moment just to pull back and take a look at the overall effect. Once you start working in details, it's so easy to get zeroed in and really close to your subject, and to fail to pull back and notice the small decisions you're making here, how they impact the painting as a whole. One thing I'm noticing is I really don't like the shape of this petal here, so I'm going to use some of my jadeite and drop in color right now while the paint is wet to create some dark values there. And you can see how strong and crisp that is. And I'm going to do the same thing I was doing with the flower petals, just adding some water to soften and create flow. Maybe a little stopping place here, an edge to suggest a leaf. And then some little spiky bits to suggest maybe pine needles or something like that. And I'm going to create, I think, some negative shapes. I'm going to see how that affects my painting, just putting in some inside shapes. So if my leaves were overlapping and there was a dark shadow in behind, I might have a kind of diamond shape, a little notch triangular shape where we start to see some shadows popping through. And you can see how impactful those are. They're also very crisp, too crisp probably, so then we want to soften a bit. They're very crisp and they're very dark, so I'm going to actually use a thirsty brush to lift a little bit as I soften. And that's just going to create a little less abrupt transition, bring it into a state of flow with the rest of the painting. And a strategy that can help you as you develop your subject is to work on a separate piece of paper a little bit and think about what types of shapes you like to create for leaves and vines, and those inner negative shapes created by the shadows. I'm going to make this petal shape really nice and crisp as well, with some dark green in behind it. One leaf shape I like is simply pressing the brush down and giving it a little tug upward, and that can create a really nice little traditional kind of teardrop petal shape. It's not a bad idea to turn your wreath if you want to continue to curve your strokes consistently. I'm kind of liking those little squiggly lines there. I think that's cute, so maybe I'll do a bit more of that over here, a little bit of that over here. I'm debating whether or not I should make my wreath a little crisper against the background. I used a little bit of indigo previously to create some negative shapes around my edges of my wreath and darkened up the lower part here to create that shadow. Do we want to enhance that a bit and make it a little stronger? We can try. And I'm not sure that enhancing that dark shadow really helped my painting at all, so I'm going to stop. I'm not going to worry about fussing with that. It doesn't have a huge impact, so I don't know how necessary it is. We're actually going to stop and let this sit for a moment, and then we're going to come back and add some fun little finishing details. So we're going to add some gold, beautiful gold, because this is a festive painting, and I think that gold would make it more festive. I have a couple of options for gold. I have the Speedball Calligraphy ink, which is a gold, but it's a really yellow kind of hue. I think I'm going to be more likely to enjoy this aqua bronze made by Schminke. This is a powder, and it is an actual metallic powder that we're going to mix with water to create our golden ink. So I'm just going to use a little bowl here, dirty little bowl, tap out a bit of this powder and add some water. And just stir it up till I get the consistency I want. And you can see how rich and beautiful that is. It's absolutely gorgeous. And this is going to be just a really beautiful to add some touches to our painting. We're going to start with those little dots in the center of our flower. Maybe a tiny bit of spatter. I'm going to use just a fine dagger striper, and we're going to create some line with the aqua bronze. And it's going to reinforce the curves in our little painting here, in our wreath, and maybe a few slightly broader marks, just pressing the brush, giving a little pull. I think my flowers, we're going to pull a little central vein down some of these petals just to reinforce some shape. And a little more spatter. And that's going to be it, I think. I don't really feel the need to add anything else. I love the quote that painting is never finished, it just stops in interesting places. And I feel like today this is the interesting place I want to stop at. A little energy from that spatter, a little sparkle, a little reminder of the beauty of a festive holiday wreath.